Hello and welcome to the Ontario Government Live Budget Webinar. My name is Allan Gregg. I'm one of 40 principals at the Earnscliffe Strategy Group, a public affairs consultancy that has specialization in government relations, public opinion research, and strategic communications. I'm joined by a number of my colleagues largely from the Toronto office. Is Chris Ball, who is a veteran of many war rooms, advisors to federal, provincial, and municipal NDP leaders. Alanna Clark, former Queen's Park staffer in the Ford government. Julie Garner, who's now evolved and risen above grubby partisan politics and is now a super consultant, largely in the Kitchener-Waterloo areas, got a big coterie of business clients. So John Whitehead, long-serving senior civil servant in the Ontario government. And our special guest, Tom Sweeting. Tom knows a little bit about budgets, having worked on 33 of them over the course of his career, 10 as he served as the former Assistant Deputy Minister in the Office of Budget and Taxation in the Ontario Ministry of Finance. I want to welcome everyone who's come, let you know that we will entertain questions, that there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Alanna is going to be monitoring that for us. We will stop a couple times over the course of an hour-long conversation, and she will read those out, and whoever feels that they are in a position to field them will provide an answer. To the extent we don't get to one of your questions, we will provide a written answer as a follow-up. So don't hesitate to be forthcoming, and that if you don't get on screen, don't worry that we won't have some kind of interaction. Now, 3 of my colleagues have actually just got out of the lockup. So I want to start with them. I mean, first, you, Alan. I mean, what's the top line here? What are the 3 big takeaways that you had, and if the government wants to put out there with this budget?
Sure. So Minister Bethlenfalvy has just delivered his first budget, this government's third, and the budget is titled Ontario's Action Plan, Protecting People's Health and Our Economy. And I think the title of the budget summarizes exactly what it's aiming to do. Part 1 is, protecting people's health, which involves a plan to defeat COVID-19, to fix long-term care, and something a little more broad, caring for people, which involves a number of supports, including mental health. And as we look to the other half of that, which is protecting our economy, there's support for workers and family, support for jobs, and support for communities. Projecting a deficit of over $30 billion for the coming year, which is a staggering number by provincial standards, and I think a staggering number for a Conservative government, but I think we all know that these are not normal times. It does predict a return to balanced budget in 2029, 2030, but it could be later than that depending on growth. So I guess the final point I'll make before turning it over to my colleagues is the government has claimed to have spent $51 billion on COVID-19. So I will pass that over to Julie and John, who were virtually with me in the lockup. And I will just say, I missed the first time that I was in a lockup with John. It was in person. It's the first and only time, and can't believe we're doing it virtually again.
Yeah, Julie, this isn't your first rodeo. I mean, what's your impression of this budget? What your major kind of sense of what these guys are trying to do?
Well, I'll start off by saying that I wasn't overly surprised. Certainly, I think there have been a lot of leaks in the weeks coming up to the budget, and certainly the 2 themes in terms of protecting our people and protecting the economy and job creators were certainly, held true to the delivery of Minister Bethlenfalvy's first budget. I would say what surprised me a little bit about it, but not, I wouldn't say in a negative or kind of an emotional way, was that they doubled down on a number of programs. A lot of times in budgets, you'll see a lot of new programs, a new program for this, a new program for that. And what we saw was them increasing the supports that they've already targeted. So you'll see that with the small business grant program that they've now doubled that, and they've doubled down again or tripled down, I guess, on the supports for parents. And again, on the northern grant programs and the regional programs, they're increasing the funding available rather than rolling out a huge swath of new. So that was a bit of a takeaway for me. There's a lot of investment there in terms of the transportation infrastructure side of things. It might not have gone as big in terms of the support for economy that I would have thought. I thought there would have been a few new things added to the mix, but otherwise it was what I was expecting.
Yeah, I was going to ask that didn't surprise you at all that it does seem to be very much an incrementalist budget. They've got a whole bunch of very specific initiatives and they've kind of doubled down on them rather than saying, we were hearing all kinds of talk 6 months ago, building back better, having a new Jerusalem, an entirely different kind. None of that is in this budget.
Absolutely, Alan, but I think we're in a very transitional period right now, and I think there's a lot of recognition of that. We're on the cusp of the third wave. We don't know whether or not we're going to be going back into another lockdown period. The economic recovery, there's been a lot of discussion over the last little while in terms of how quickly the economy is going to recover, especially in those sectors that have been not as hard hit. There's a lot of discussion around consumer spending exploding and potentially the lack of need for government intervention in certain areas. I think this government is keeping their powder dry until a little bit more is known and investing surgically in areas where they know there's a great need. So I think that there's room for them to continue to roll out new programs, whether it waits till the next budget, but they certainly, I think, are keeping some back in order to be able to react to what we will see over the next 6 to 12 months.
John, you've actually crafted a number of budgets in Ontario. What was your impression of this one?
Yeah, not as many as Tom. I'm only at 28. He's at 33. So I'm I'm the junior partner in this arrangement. But it is hard with the numbers as big as they are. It's hard to think of this as incremental, and yet it does seem to be. And one of the balancing factors that undoubtedly this year's deficit will get airtime, but the accumulating amount of debt that will occur over the next decade while this budget is being slowly brought back into balance is just eye-watering. By 2023-24, we're going to cross the $500 billion of debt level. I can remember when we crossed over into $100 billion of debt and that being a very big deal. But we're doing it now against the backdrop of an aging population and obviously a very, very volatile and difficult competitive environment as we move forward, as all countries move forward and try to rebuild their economies. We lost close to 6% of GDP last year thanks to this pandemic. It's an enormous challenge going forward. So keeping some powder dry, again, hard as it is with the numbers as big as they are to say that, but is a very sensible kind of an approach at this point, because this is a conversation that needs to be had over a period of time, how to deal with the enormous amounts of debt.
I want to bring our colleague Tom Sweeting in to talk a little bit about the art and science of budget making. I mean, at the best of times, this is an act of uncertainty. I mean, you're working on all kinds of forecasting, prognostications. Here we are in absolutely uncharted water. We're right in the middle of a pandemic that's going now into the start of its second year. What would make doing this budget particularly challenging compared to other ones in the past?
Well, I think that all budgets are documents that are trying to find a path through the many, many things the government could do to what it's actually going to do. And because they're forward-looking documents, they rely on predictions. And with predictions, there's always going to be uncertainty. But I would describe what typically happens with budget planning is comfortable uncertainty. Yes, there is uncertainty, but people will be able to advise decision makers on that they have a pretty good sense of what is going on right now, and they're reasonably comfortable with where they see things going. As you just pointed out, that's not the case now, in my view. I think it's been a very difficult budget to put together in that sense. The traditional reasonableness of estimates is hard to come by. The playbook that's been built up over the years for making budget decisions is missing some pages now, as we're dealing with the uncharted waters. So where there is normally a fair bit of confidence that government decision makers can have in what they're hearing about the information on which a budget rests, not so much now. So that really breeds caution in what government is doing. It's not a surprise at all to see elements of what people have already described as happening in the budget, and and that is consistent with good politics, because one of the things we learned early on when we were making budgets, going back many years, is that government would much rather have to deal with explaining how it underestimated the good news than explaining why it overestimated the good news.
Kind of rule 101 about politics and government, that always under promise, over perform. You talk about this, the pandemic's basically thrown the traditional budget rule book out of the window. I mean, we've seen the impact on both the economy and the response of governments being unprecedented in both instances because of the pandemic. And part of that unprecedented is the unevenness in which how the pandemic has impacted the economy. I mean, Shopify doesn't need any help right now, but Porter Airlines probably the difference is just massive. I mean, have you seen a circumstance or a budget where you would have to be that kind of pointed in order to, almost with a laser beam, try to aim policies against vulnerable populations, vulnerable sectors, and not really worry that much about the macroeconomic impact?
Well, you know what, I think it's certainly not unheard of. Obviously, you can go through any number of budgets and find targeted actions based at particular programs or interests. The key in this particular case is, from my standpoint, is government had to find a balance between fighting the pandemic and boosting recovery. And it's quite clear that fighting the pandemic is the primary objective of this budget, and that just makes sense. It's where there are differences in outlooks for sectors, government's going to have to carefully think through that. They've started to signal some of the things that they're planning on doing. Certainly, some of their the groups in which they count as supporters are being some of the most vocal critics of what government policies have done to date. And so there's no doubt that that's key to how the government moves forward. But this is basically a demand-driven recession, or a lack of demand-driven recession. Right. And and the reality is that it really takes recovery of demand in order to be able to see the economic progress. The government is doesn't have a whole heck of a lot of ability to influence demand in an aggregate sense, especially in an open global economy. There is that aspect as well. So they're better off focusing on where they can have, I'd say a more significant impact. And in these current times, and with the caution that's naturally being bred, I think they should focus on things like shattered balance sheets and how to help business reestablish. Along with that comes the challenge of, well, who exactly is going to be able to, which balance sheets are going to be able to recover and which ones aren't. And that's, of course, dicey politically.
Yeah, I know you're anxious to actually get off this screen so that you can grub around in the actual budget talk. But I got one more question, because you and John Whitehead wrote a very interesting article, which we published and we'll make available again to our viewers, that said, among other things, I mean, what the pandemic has really said to government is that there might be a better way to deliver services than you've been delivering them in the past. I mean, how do you see this pandemic permanently changing the way government sees itself and the way it delivers services in the future?
Well, there's no doubt that necessity is the mother of invention, and that the pandemic has produced a fair bit of an invention in the way government does business. In one sense, that's not surprising because this is a government that believes in finding ways to do things more efficiently and more effectively. And they, from the get-go, there's been a focus on modernization of government. So, some of the things we saw, physician consultations online, online learning, court access to courts through virtual methods. They're showing that it can be done. I'm not sure that would be areas that would be at the front of the line for government attention. Certainly, they will want to be able to move as much online as they can, and keep the ones that they've moved on, because people are able to adapt to them. Sort of you buy your lottery tickets online. Hey, you know what? That's an easy way of doing things. So it will stay. It will be a way of the future, not only because it's part of, I'll say, the government's wheelhouse when it comes to its policy intentions, but it's part of affordability. And with the demands on spending the government's facing, and with the sort of the reality of the uncertainty that's around, going for years out. The economic forecast is quite robust for 2 years, and then it drops right off again.
Right, of course.
So it's it's not really a recipe for a lot of fiscal adventure, and certainly the ability to find ways to do things more efficiently that free up resources for new priorities will be an important part of the future.
Well, Tom Sweeting, former Assistant Deputy Minister, Office of the Budget and Taxation, Ontario Ministry of Finance, 1997 to 2006. Thank you so much for joining us. He's principal, obviously, at Earnscliffe, and offers us sage advice on fiscal policy all the time. So thanks again. I want to bring in Chris. Chris, the theme of this budget, the title is Protecting People's Health in Our Economy. We all know that incumbent governments rarely get a better opportunity than a budget to position themselves, to signal, these are my priorities, these are who I'm for out there. What's this government trying to do with this budget? What theme is it trying to express? And what is it trying to signal to the average Ontario voter?
I think so. This is definitely not this old style kind of campaign budget where you see sort of large thematic pieces that are targeted at specific audiences that they want to vote for them in 8 months. What you're seeing is this is kind of a chicken in every pot. You're seeing the government try to at least present a sense of, we've got this. We've got the pandemic under control, and we're trying to fix some of the problems that the pandemic has brought forward in long-term care and in other places. So I think this matches up though with where kind of Ontarians and Canadians are just in general right now. As a general political mindset, they are incredibly pragmatically minded right now, in that we are getting to a point in the pandemic where people just want the pandemic to be over, and whatever help the government can provide to accelerate that or to stop the bad thing from happening again is going to be, I think, widely praised. Another interesting theme that's still kind of hanging out in the background is that the government is still maintaining their core thematic around of economic and fiscal integrity, right? So they came into power, preaching fiscal responsibility, and gone are the days of the taps are open and the party with the taxpayers' dollar is over. Now, the pandemic is it's less of a party with the taxpayers' dollar and more of a let's throw money at the problem. But you do see references to them charting some sort of a path back to balance, whether or not it may not be, probably not the path that they wanted or the timeline that they wanted. We'll see if they're still in power in 2029 or whenever they have in the budget. And then there's also there's some interesting political seed planting in some core areas. So if you look at some of the transit investments, there's obviously a lot of transit investment in Toronto in the 905. That's going to be a vote-rich area for the government going forward. You're also seeing some investments in Hamilton, where there's a bit of a problem with an Lrt there, and those are seats that can swing three ways. So they're looking to shore up a bit there. And there's also been some investment in Waterloo Region around and the innovation corridor around transit, which is also an interesting spot and a bit of a target, I think, for this government as well. So it's not your traditional, here are the 4 key things we're taking into a campaign. It's, we're going to fix the pandemic. We're going to try to be we're trying to still be balanced and laying some track for a future budget and future campaign promises.
Julie, you said something interesting in your opening remarks. This budget seems to be more, I'm finishing something we started rather than I'm starting something brand new. I mean, if there is a focus, it continues to be on managing the pandemic. I mean, what's your assessment of this government's job performance to this date? And what's your further assessment of how this budget is going to help or hurt their reputation in that regard?
Well, I think Tom Sweeting said it right, that this budget is really still about fighting the pandemic, and fighting the pandemic from a people perspective, as well as fighting the pandemic from an economic and jobs perspective. In terms of their job to date, the provinces have played a kind of a role of almost surgically kind of going in and then supporting those that have been left behind by the massive programs that have been rolled out by the federal government. And that's why you see some additional kind of attention being paid to those specific sectors that have been hardest hit by the economy and the small business grant programs. They've also been really surgically kind of focused on delivering and rolling out programs that are going to help shore up their supply chain in terms of PPE. And then also looking to the future in terms of how do we attract jobs and investment. And so this government has managed to take their jobs focus, which was their, from day one, people's pockets and jobs and economy, and continue to shift it into a pandemic lens without having to alter course in a substantial way, although kind of really having to be more precise with targeting. Their performance has been, at times, I think what I've been hearing from our clients in the business sector is at times they've been slow to roll things out. So other provinces have moved forward faster with rent programs and relief programs for certain sectors. And maybe not as broad as other jurisdictions have, but they've certainly kind of covered off, I think, the key bases they had to over the course of this year, with some still out there wanting more and demanding more, and we'll see whether they bring that to the table with some of these new programs.
Alana, off the top, John said that there's 2 broad themes here: one, protecting people's health and our economy. Of course, in addition to pandemic management, there is the whole notion of economic recovery. Ever since John Maynard Keynes, economic recovery meant stimulus spending. It's been very interesting since the federal government's fall fiscal update that we're starting to hear economists and various business interests saying, this economy may not need you to stimulate it. There's enough cash, and there's gushers of cash right now in both the business sector and also in the consumer. And maybe you should just keep your powder dry. These guys seem to have listened to that. Is that your takeaway on things? And were you surprised at all about the kind of the lack of stimulus in this budget?
Yeah, I think your characterization is exactly right. And if I was in their shoes, I'd be doing very much the same thing, I think. The one thing we know is that we have a pandemic in front of us. We have some tremendous healthcare needs. And the province has some brush fires going in various parts of the economy, but the impacts of the pandemic probably are not fully understood yet, but it's fairly self-evident they're not evenly distributed. Right. We still have 305,000 people out of work, but as the government mentioned in the budget, I mean, there are uneven impacts with respect to gender, with respect to age, with respect to sectoral attachment. And the full impacts of this are not yet known, nor is it clear what a subnational government could actually do about some of these things in the very near term. And so keeping some powder dry, again, even though the numbers are enormous, as I said, it does make sense. And Chris mentioned in his comments people feeling pragmatically minded at this point. I think that's where the government is. pragmatically minded. This thing isn't over yet. We're still looking at terrible case counts in Ontario. We are still looking at way more deaths than we would like. We're looking at a supply chain of vaccines that's hit and miss at the moment. So knowing exactly what to do and how to hit is a very difficult question. It makes good sense that they are holding back a little bit.
Yeah, well, when Chris talks about the thematics here, I mean, protecting people's health and our economy, I mean, both are really quite defensive. They're not saying we're going to build a new Jerusalem. They're going to protect that which we have right now. I mean, Alanna, you've been looking at the Q&A there. Is there anything that you want to raise to the panel here right now?
Yeah, there was an interesting question that came in from Patrick. So Patrick asks, do you see tax hikes coming to pay for this in the future years? Or do you see the feds riding to the rescue, or at least pitching in a bit? If you don't mind, I'll maybe take a quick 1-2 on the political end. And I think John would be really well placed to do a bit of a deep dive.
Go for it.
Sounds good. Well, I mean, look, the reality is this has to be paid for somehow. And at some point, there's only so many efficiencies, and so much waste that can be found in government. I know this government is, especially pre-pandemic and particularly under Minister Bethlenfalvy, we're working really hard to find those. So, I mean, my thought is at some point, tax hikes, whether this government likes it or not, I think are going to have to be on the table. And, we talk about a return to balance in 2029, 2030. That's a little ways away. And I think we all know that governments last about 10 years, provincially and federally in this country, give or take. So, will the Conservatives be in power in 2029? I mean, selfishly, I hope so, but that's going to be up to the will of the electorate. And, I think if there's another party in power who might be a little more, open to tax hikes and might be a bit more supportive of that, I think that's what you're going to end up seeing at some point in time. As for the feds riding to the rescue, I'm gonna leave that portion as well up to John. I know he's quite the pro when it comes to Fed prop relations. So
yeah, I mean, we did see again they're rattling the saber on a larger health transfer from the federal government, and many have said that while there's been lots of cooperation, federal provincial, this is setting up some real tensions going forward. But I want to put a little bit of a twist on that for John, and then invite Julie and Chris to join in. I mean, have we reached a stage where people's expectations around taxation and spending are fundamentally changed? I mean, our colleague Elie Alboim talks about this all the time. There's an expectation now that taxes are never supposed to go up. That's always a bad thing. And governments really can play a way bigger role in solving our problems than we ever anticipated in the past. Are we in a new kind of mindset and a new regime in government right now, John?
It's treacherous territory for governments to go in and raise taxes. It was so normal in the 80s. It was so normal in the early part of the 90s. And then somewhere along the way, it became anathema to raise taxes. And, the government does have other ways out. It has got along for years with charging fees where somebody benefits directly from a service. And you can do that to a certain extent, but mostly they've relied on economic growth to support the spending side, not to ratchet up taxes. And certainly any time in the near term is not a time to be raising taxes on pretty much anybody, I would think. It's going to be very, very, as bad as it is during good times, it's going to be very, very difficult in the next little while. Spending management is the other one that often comes up in a really big way for this. And I would just say, from my former role in the government of Ontario, there are vast tracts of the budget that just don't move. You could wish you could spend $20 billion less per year, but you can't make interest on debt move, and you can't stop corrections, and you can't stop policing, and you can't stop
transfers.
Other
things. Yeah,
all of those things continue. And so the idea of just doing everything through spending management isn't on. So a balance of economic growth, care around spending, being conscious of people's pocketbooks. And then there's the federal government, which given my history with it, it's always been a big wild card. If I was in the government of Ontario right now, I'd be thinking very much about what happens when the existing federal supports, the extraordinary supports that are there, start pulling away, when the federal government steps out of territory that they don't usually occupy, but they are occupying now to support the economy through this pandemic. So there's no easy answer to this. Tax increases alone wouldn't do it. Spending cuts alone wouldn't do it. Economic growth alone probably won't do it. So it's a complex question.
Chris, you want to add to this whole tax and spend discussion?
Yeah, there's also this really interesting political space around what the government will consider as the new baseline once the pandemic is over in certain sectors, right? And so we're already starting to see there was a article, I think last week, around potential cuts to teachers coming down the line, because they said, well, we've ramped up all these teachers and we won't need all of these education supports at the end of the pandemic, right? And so there's going to be I think that's partially where you're seeing some of the they're holding their powder a bit, so it's not be perceived as cutting in the time of a pandemic, but also they're looking to see kind of where the long-term horizon is, but also where the federal government is at. There's a lot of interest right now with regards to kind of that tension between the Fed and the Prov, right? And I think that, when you look at where, this premier is trying to at least position himself, is not the sort of partisan, I'm going to whack the prime minister every 5 minutes, try to be as much of a good facilitator as possible, hoping to see that there'll be some help for the province in the next budget, but then still have that hammer for the next year if it doesn't get what he wants, which is just sort of, you want to be able to keep that powder dry, not just fiscally, but also politically, in order to help your chances of re-election.
I want to shift it a little bit. It's almost become a cliche that what this pandemic has done is expose vulnerabilities that existed before the coronavirus arrived. But nowhere is that more true than in terms of long-term care. And you're in this space working in this, Julie. Talk to me about your reaction to how the government has tried to deal with this issue in this budget, and whether you were actually surprised that they didn't try to do more.
Over the past, so thanks for the question. I've been working in this space for the last 6 years with a number of different clients, and none of the problems that were exposed by the pandemic are new. And it's been frustrating that and saddening to see how many lives have been lost because of inaction for so many years. I will say that, over the past 4 months really has been the intensive period of change and announcement in this particular sector. We saw the big one being the 4 hours of care and the move over the next 4 years to that standard, which has been something that unions and residents' rights advocates have been championing for a number of years. And we've also seen a number of other investments in terms of facilities coming on to make more spaces and better spaces. So we saw those awful ward rooms being the culprit for a lot of the fatalities and infection spread within facilities. And so all of those are accounted for. The long-term care envelope was largely rolled out ahead of the budget today. So I wasn't actually expecting any new net new funding within this. I think where we continue to see a bit of criticism in the long-term care space is how quickly the provincial government reacted when this first started. Other jurisdictions, in terms of even getting more PSWs into the field, moved much faster. Quebec rolling out an incredibly aggressive program in June, July last year, and Ontario not rolling theirs out until the fall. So it's been the speed of action in long-term care that's been frustrating over the past year, but I wasn't surprised with anything here. I would say the one thing I'd hoped for was to see a little bit more on wages and wage permanence. Last week, we saw them continue the $3 an hour pandemic pay, which helps about 60% of workers in the long-term care sector, but it's needed and it needs to be made permanent in order to really help with the attraction and retention of workers and rolled out across the board. And so we didn't see that today. It wasn't a surprise, but it was an area that I was quietly hoping for.
Well, in fact, we talk about kind of the incrementalism in this budget, basically taking a program that already exists and just adding to something rather than creating something new. And this really does seem to be the case in terms of long-term care. They're going to build more spaces. They might put air conditioning in. They will train more PSWs. But Chris Jagmeet Singh has says we're going to nationalize this sector. Now, granted, that's the NDP, but were you surprised, given that this is a political vulnerability? I mean,
Alan,
this
before
really
you
is.
go to Chris, I just want to say that in this particular area, I can't say the investments have been incremental, because the 4 hours of care is something that has been so it's been championed and by unions and other groups and advocates for so long, and this is a massive investment. It gets us to where we need to be, but it isn't incremental, it's substantial.
Well, again, I don't want to
that would be the only thing I want to change there. And
semantics, but if 4 hours care it's not like there was no care before. It's just an increase of care that was already there. And that's incrementalism. But anyway, let me take a step back. I mean, I cannot identify a bigger political vulnerability for this government than the performance of long-term care in this province. I mean, we've had almost 100% of people who have died in this province are senior citizens, and of that, the vast majority are in long-term care. If we were to solve long-term care, you'd barely have more deaths in this province than you would from seasonal flu. So the notion that they were going to build a ring fence, if they weren't going to do something that was really dramatic, surprised me. I just wanted to whether surprise anyone else. Chris?
I don't know that it surprised me, to be honest. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about taking the private out of LTC here in Ontario, but I don't see it happening. There's also other gaps when it comes to PSW support, right? So the wage increase for PSWs, there's no commitment beyond June 30th, 2021. So these are people who have been relied upon throughout this pandemic, who has taken care of grandma and granddad and mom and dad and done an admirable job, but they don't get to keep their raise beyond June 30th. You see, the resident quality inspections, the hiring commitment is not of like, there's about 27,000 staff. It's not specific to PSWs over 4 years. So I think what we've seen is the government be very mindful of the immediate shock and awe that happened with the Army report. But I'm not seeing any, I don't foresee any bold action on taking the private out of LTC. There's been a long history of Conservative governments putting the private more into healthcare, not less into healthcare. And so I'm not holding my breath on this particular government making the LTC system public.
Allan, I mean, your former job was to look at policy and figure out how to make it really good politics, or how to take really good politics and translate that into policy. You started talking about this a little bit, but talk to me about the politics of this budget. I mean, is this government just trying to survive right now, the pandemic, or do you see things in this budget that are politically signaling different constituencies out there and trying to move them forward to an election that probably is going to happen in a year or so?
Well, I'm going to say yes to both of your questions. So part one is yes, I think this is a budget that's just targeted at, getting through the next, however long, I guess the next year of this ongoing pandemic. I'm actually about to celebrate my second pandemic birthday next month. So it's been going on for a while, but I do think it's a budget that's a little more focused on survival. But at the same time, I think there are some themes. So look, I think there's wins for families, specifically families in Toronto and the suburbs, everything from, subways to the $400 per child, $500 for special needs children. I believe it's the third payment through that program for kids, especially with the added cost of schooling at home. I think there's wins for the rural communities that, have sent Conservative MPPs to Queen's Park through a long Liberal government. And whether or not the Conservatives in power, I think largely will continue to do so. Not that you can take anything for granted, but things like, the expanded broadband, things like regional investments that specifically don't apply to Toronto and the GTA and don't apply to Ottawa. I think There's some, broad thematic wins for women, which are voters that Conservatives always need to be able to go to. Conservatives or Liberals need to be able to go to form a government, especially those in the suburbs of the GTA. There is a task force, and I know some people on this call might not be the biggest task force fans, but that can be another conversation. But, a task force to look at the unique challenges that women have faced, during this pandemic. I think that $400 per child is something that will appeal to women that I've already mentioned. And a focus on long-term care. Is that a political play, or is that, I don't really think so. I think that's just something that has to be done in these times. But, when you're looking at more training for PSWs, more jobs in those sectors, I'm sure that, the Conservatives are going to be hoping to turn some of those into voters. The other thing that I found really interesting, I believe it's about $50 million, but please don't quote me on the amount, funds available for community and faith-based groups. And they highlighted faith-based groups. Those are voters that, Conservatives, tend to, hope to rely on, but at a minimum, are looking for the support of. And, they've been excluded from some federal funding of late. So I think there are some wins there. I think there is politics in this budget. I will say I think it's hard to lose voters with spending this big, but they've got some criticism from the small business community prior to this budget for the funds being hard to access, difficult to go through that process. So more funds, the same amount paid out again to the same people, there's going to be some people who are unhappy about that.
I want to go to Chris here, because he's worked the other side of the aisle, and that not only are budgets opportunities for governments to position themselves, they're opportunities for the opposition to attack. I mean, what could the opposition get their teeth into? What is there about this budget that they will use to attack the Ford government?
I think Alanna was talking about me, by the way, when I was talking about the panel.
No, I never name names.
I do actually find this idea that we need a panel to study the barriers to employment and entry into the economy for women to be something that the opposition should take full aim at. I don't think we need a panel to help like it's not a mystery all of a sudden, like, well, why aren't women being hired? Why aren't women, like, anyway, and a lot of the times these things become kind of bottlenecks, right? These things become, oh, we're going to study it, we're going to need a panel, we're going to do this, and then down the line we put out a report. These are issues where women have 5% unemployment right now. Like the numbers are staggering, and we don't need another panel. So that's something that I think, focusing on the she recovery, which is a popular way of framing the post-pandemic recovery, is going to be a good thing for the opposition parties to jump on. Sure, targeted investments in some childcare is fine, but when you have that level of unemployment and you get a tax credit, that ain't enough. I think you're already seeing the opposition start to put out some markers around the potential for cuts down the line, especially in the education sector. You're going to start seeing a little bit more of the drumbeat on, I think there's no real new help for long-term care, as we kind of discussed there. Some of the staff hiring there was previously promised. It's stretched out over 5 years. And very sort of like targeted riding specific stuff, like there's no hospital for Brampton, which has been something that has been a hot button issue in that riding for a very long time, and is not a part of this budget. And that's an interesting thing, because there's like a really interesting new Democrat conservative political dynamic there in some of those ridings. So I think you're going to have to see the opposition walk a bit of a line to understanding that, we are trying to manage a live crisis while we're doing this, but at the same time, the types of investments that aren't being made are investments that are hurting our ability to recover. And you're starting to already see that from Andrew Horwath and the opposition.
Is it bad politics to attack a government in a pandemic?
I think you have to be a bit more artful.
It's tougher, right?
Yeah, you have to be artful compared to some of the ad hominem stuff that we've seen in the past, right? I think you have to focus on people-based solutions, which sounds like a buzzword, but it's true. Like, you have to focus on the things that are going to reach into somebody's living room and grab them and see themselves not reflected in the government's agenda, more so than some of the you know, the rhetoric that you see leading up to an election, which is usually sort of like the Raptors in Jurassic Park kind of testing the fence to see what lands, right? So you have to be more tactical.
If I could
John,
then,
just a second, I'm going to go to John here now, but there have been members of the right and business commentators who've lamented, and we talked about this a little bit already, that no one cares about the deficit anymore, but they don't value fiscal conservatism. I mean, Chris said that, look, they at least included in this a timeline to balance, whereas the feds in their fiscal update did not. Talk to me about what has to happen to get to balance by the year 2029, 2030.
Yeah, it is. It is not an easy road. It is. The budget is made up of a lot of different pieces, and I'm not the partisan one on the panel here today, but I'll dare to stick a toe in partisan waters. There's not one spending line. There's not one tax preference. There's nothing in the government's books that doesn't have somebody to support it. All of them do something arguably positive. Every one of those things arguably does something positive. There's very small things governments can do to manage spending. Taking fax machines away is perhaps a few years late, but you know, that would be one thing. But it's very limited. Very limited things.
That's in this budget. And no courier pigeons either, probably.
No courier pigeons, and we are out of the buggy whip industry. But it's very limited things, and so it really does demand. And this is what I was trying to say off the top. It really does demand a different kind of a conversation than one we've been having. It's not that we have a deliberate spending problem. The government didn't choose this. It didn't choose to have revenues drop. It didn't choose to have massive new spending requirements. This was placed upon us. If we're to exit it in a useful way, having a more thoughtful conversation that may need to be supported by some government papers or some sort of a forum to talk about, okay, what do we do? Because economic growth will do some things. Right. There's probably prospects in modernizing government. Is everything we used to do still back on the table? Do we still have to do all of it?
Some of the stuff that Tom Sweeting talked about actually could lead to savings.
Precisely. You know, the role of the private sector. There is a myth that somehow a lot of the things that government does are public services, and some things are genuinely public services, but there are others. I mean, even healthcare itself has a big private sector component in it. You know, thinking about how, I probably just let loose a can of worms, but thinking about how government and private sector can interface on more than just, for example, P3 projects for infrastructure is another area that would probably
this segues right into to Julie. I mean, we talked that there isn't much on the stimulus side, but there is stuff there. Infrastructure, you know, we've got an infrastructure bank now, federally. Infrastructure is not just deemed to be spending, it's investment. I know, Julie, you've been watching this budget very, very closely because you've been working for 2 years to get high-speed rail or two-way, one-way, all day.
All day go, Alan.
Connect the corridor. What is in this budget that you know, that touches on infrastructure and that can get more private sector involved?
Sure. Well, they are certainly pursuing a transit-oriented development model a lot in their GO expansion across the network. But I would say that certainly in this particular area for stimulus, they know that transportation infrastructure is a winner. In terms of people and job creators, it is a top priority amongst them in terms of reducing congestion. It seems odd right now because I haven't actually been to Toronto in a year to think that I'm actually fighting for this train that's going to take me to my office there, but I am, because I know it will return. I know that our highways are congested, and that's causing huge amounts of money to be put on the cost of goods and services and goods in our economy. And we know that the best way and most efficient way to move people is through transit investments. So that they're doubling down on the transit as well as the highways in this budget. And they also know that certainly those construction jobs, those skilled trades jobs are also key to stimulating the economy and ways that they can get shovels in the ground and dollars being spent within our economy very, very quickly. So we saw projects projects that are shovel ready, two of them being singled out in this budget. One of them is the one that, yes, I've been working on for 2 years, and that's the two-way all-day go and the connected corridor. So hundreds of millions of dollars that we estimate looking to be invested in that particular project in the very short term, as well.
It's between Kitchener-Waterloo and Toronto. That's
correct, in the innovation corridor. Yeah, right through. It'll connect the corridor to Pearson Airport, and is a major driver of job growth and investment predicted in this particular area. So really doubling down on advanced manufacturing and tech sector. And then we see the other, Chris mentioned it in the political kind of commentary earlier, but the other investment that was singled out that was sort of new but being alluded to for some time was the Hamilton Lrt, which got a mention today as the fifth key priority in terms of transit. That's going to be a multi-billion-dollar project that's estimated to not only create those jobs, but also stimulate a lot of economic activity in that particular area. So popular, but also kind of serving multiple purposes in terms of stimulating the economy.
We're kind of almost running out of time, but I want to go to Alanna and see if there's any questions that the people who are listening want to pose that you think we should tackle on air.
I mean, questions have been pouring in, so I think the challenge is narrowing it down to just one. But maybe if we go quick, maybe Allan will let us have a second one. But there's an interesting question here from an anonymous attendee, and they ask, the Alberta budget and the rhetoric around it made it sound like the federal government has abandoned the province. There appears to be less of that here. Why is that?
Who'd like to take that on? That's interesting. I mean, first you buy into the premise. I mean, is the Alberta government in the last Alberta budget far more combative in terms of the tension between federal provincial financial relations than this one?
All right, I'll take. So I feel like, I mean, yeah, Alberta has traditionally been a bit of the one to throw the rocks at the federal government a bit easier than others, right? There's, from the West wants in and a whole bunch of things throughout our history of Confederation. So I think if there's just a different vibe in that province versus Ontario. I think Ontario likes to pick fights with the feds, but likes to do it somewhat politely. And I think that's sort of that kind of crosses all political stripes. Like there haven't been like massive provincial federal dust-ups of late, but also I think that Doug Ford in the Premier is trying to position himself as a bit of an honest broker in the province and across the country and the council.
Well, I want to bring Alanna in on that, because I mean that certainly was not his posture when he won election. He was the most combative premier. It's almost like he woke up one morning and said, "Oh, just this compromise stuff actually works out. It's good politics." Has there been a change in the posture of this government over its tenure?
I think there definitely has, and there's been a change as well at the senior staffing levels. So when you look at the Premier's office and some of those senior staff that came in and were sort of on the campaign team and helped bring the Premier to power, most notably, of course, Dean French. Well, after about a year, those people have either left or been forced to leave, and I think a lot of that challenge and tone from the people surrounding him. Well, there's been a change in the people surrounding him. Right now we have Jamie Wallace, incredibly well respected, leading the Premier's office. I think you have more, I won't say more calm hands at the table, but a little more thoughtful. And I think the Premier's also realized that COVID really shouldn't be a partisan fight. We've seen him develop that incredibly close relationship, well respected, with Minister Friedland, with the finance minister federally. The two of them have, developed something I think is actually quite sweet. I actually really enjoy seeing some of the media coverage about that. But I think the Premier, I want to say also he doesn't necessarily come from that traditional partisan background. He comes from municipal politics. At his core, I think he wants to be liked. I think he wants to do, the right thing. Does he always succeed? I think there'd be some different opinions around this table, but I think he wants to be liked. I think he wants to do the right thing. And I think Chris makes a great point that Alberta is just a little more combative by nature. So I think when you put all those things in a blender, you get this more conciliatory approach.
We've only got a couple of minutes. Go ahead, John.
Sorry, Alan. Ontario is just historically different too. I mean,
Yeah,
we
some of
don't.
us are old enough to remember when Ontario was considered the honest broker of Canadian federalism. Bill
Yeah.
Davis always.
Always.
That in
It's
history
always had that. It's always had that role. We haven't suffered the boom bust cycles that Alberta suffers. We haven't got Quebec's, kind of orientation to jurisdiction first, and we don't have kind of singular issues like some of the smaller provinces do. We have a multiplicity of issues. We have to work with the feds on a variety of things, and it tends to be reflected in the way we work with them, over time on fiscal relations.
Just going to finish by going around the table, starting with Julie. Any final thoughts? What are the newspapers going to say tomorrow? What's the headline? What are your final thoughts on this?
I think the newspapers are going to be pretty reasonably balanced around this. I think we're in such a precarious time that, as we were talking earlier about kind of criticizing in the midst of a pandemic, it's tough. I think that if they are critical, it'll be that there's just not enough to help those who most desperately need it, and in particular people. A lot of the support programs are kind of rolled out land-based. So if you're making $100,000, you still get $400 for your 6-year-old versus if you're not employed. So some of that may be reflected in terms of who is targeted by this budget, who will receive the most benefit from tax credits for childcare. And so we'll see the vulnerable, I think, criticisms there, but otherwise I think it's going to be a fairly positive reflection on the budget and stay the course budget to keep things steady in Ontario and wait out through the pandemic while keeping some in the reserves to support Ontario depending on what happens.
Chris, you've worked in the media, both for CBC and Vice. What's the headline tomorrow?
So you're going to see probably pandemic budget with cash handouts for business and families. That'll be the big headline, right? But the devil's in the details. It's really more day 2, day 3, and what narratives actually sink in at the end of the day, right? And so I'm interested in watching the part about the panel the panel about barriers to employment for women, and sort of how that gets framed and how far that gets pushed on the 2nd and 3rd day stories. But I think you're going to see spends billions, hands out to business, hands out to people who need it, and that's it.
Alanna, final thoughts?
Well, I think a lot of pieces of this budget have already been announced. I think what's going to come out of this, I think Chris makes a great point again about, what's day 2, day 3. I think government's going to be driving the message that they're providing support, for health, providing support for families and for communities. And I think the question is, ultimately, is it enough? And I think there's always going to be people who can say, spend more, invest more. And so I think that's the big question that people are going to have leaving this budget. How does this affect their electability in the next election? I mean, my belief is that the PC government will be reelected. I don't think there's anything in this budget that particularly harms their reelection, but to me, I don't think the budget really changes it.
Final word to you, John.
I don't know that there will be anybody who will come out and say something that the government did in this budget was just plain wrong, wrong-headed, wrong direction, wrong anything. It's pragmatic. It does a few things and it hits arguably some bushfires. To me, it probably would have been much more vulnerable for the government and perhaps much less good use of money if they'd come out firing in all directions. And so if you consider the alternative to what is a fairly incremental and focused budget, it's perhaps more risky, less risky than what they could have done as an alternative.
Time's up. Chris Ball, Alanna Clark, Julie Garner, and John Whitehead, colleagues, thank you very much for joining me. Real good conversation. For those of you out there, we're going to send you a link to the excellent paper that John Whitehead and Tom Sweeting wrote on budget making. You also should tune in. I think it's the first Thursday of every month. That is April 1st coming up, where we have a political strategy panel once a month as a regular scheduled event that Earnscliffe hosts, and that we're also, just yesterday, the federal government announced that they will bring in their first budget in 2 years, again, outside of the fiscal year of April 19th, and we'll be doing another webinar then, so stay tuned, and thank you all. If we didn't get to your questions, we will send you a note back, and otherwise, there's also a link to the recording from this, and we will send that out as well. So thank you all, and be safe.